Hi, and welcome to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. I'm State Controller Tom DiNapoli. We are doing this virtually once again. We look forward to the day when we'll be back in the studio of MNN. We're past presidential election. There's a lot to talk about happening out there. The vaccine is the big question, when that will happen. A lot of concern about federal stimulus. Will we be getting more? If so, when? Hopefully, especially with the news about vaccines, we're starting to glimpse some light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. But certainly we're living through great uncertainty. We need to continue to be careful, use your masks and social distancing, of all of that, as we know COVID cases have been rising of late. And we know that our city of New York and New York State are facing historic budget challenges and certainly an economic outlook for a number of years to come. So we're going to talk about some of the key issues facing us with two very important Albany lawmakers. My first guest is Senator Brian Benjamin. He represents the Upper West Side, East Harlem and Harlem. And Senator Benjamin chairs the Committee on Budget and Revenues. That's like a controller kind of committee. Senator Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad you're looking so well, and thank you for making some time to chat with us.
Thank you so much for what you're doing in this important time. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, we all got to work together. Let me just say at the outset, and then we'll get to the questions. You know, I've been quite an admirer of yours from the beginning. You more than hit the ground running, being elected to the Senate in 2017. What an incredible background for some of our Manhattan viewers that may be just getting to know you. Certainly rooted in the Harlem community, learned the value of hard work from your parents, went to Brown University, MBA from Harvard, worked in investment banking and finance at Morgan Stanley, built affordable housing, chaired Community Board 10, so many other involvements, and then came to Albany and has had an incredible impact on so many issues, criminal justice reform. And I want to say, shout out to you, as I've done before, for really getting me as trustee of our state pension fund to focus on the issue of pension fund money going to private prisons. We only had a little bit, but still, you know, they're against the law in New York. It's certainly not, doesn't make any sense from an investment point of view, but through some of our index funds, we still had some investments there. And really thanks to you, Senator, for really, you know, challenging me, you know, in a positive way to say, hey, Tom, time to get rid of those stocks, those private prisons. So you really were one of the leaders in getting us to divest, you know, and that we don't do lightly and we don't do frequently. Affordable housing, tenant protection. I know you care about pensions. You know, your family are union background people, and you know I've appreciated that support. And as I mentioned, you chair a very important committee on budget and revenues. I think that's where maybe we'll start out. I mean, this is a tough time with our state budget. You know, what's your perspective as before you know it, we're heading into the next budget cycle? It's hard to believe, but January's around the corner. Governor will have his executive budget. You know, we've had a shortfall thus far that we've been managing. Big questions about federal stimulus. Give us your perspective as chair of that important Senate committee as to where you think we're at right now.
First of all, thank you so much, State Controller Tom DiNapoli, for that amazing introduction. And let me say before I jump to your question, you know, one of the things that I really appreciated about you is, you know, I was a new legislator, and I came to you with some concerns around the private prison piece. And I just really respected the fact that we were able to have constructive dialogues. You put me in touch with the right staff people, and there was a respectful process that I believe is what we need to get back to with a Joe Biden administration. How Democrats can, whether it's disagree or agree, but to work with each other on issues where we need to find resolution, not come and picket your office and and call and say Tom DiNapoli should be fired, but to come to you and say, you know, I have these concerns. Let's figure out how we get there. So I really want to thank you for your leadership as a leader, statewide leader on that, because I really appreciate it. And it's a symbol to me of how I should operate going forward. So I just want to first say that to you. Secondly, in regards to the budget, you know, one of the things that we feel very strongly in the Senate is that, you know, the COVID crisis caused certain decisions to be made that were state induced, right? So the governor of the state of New York said that we will shut down businesses. So there were a number of decisions that unleashed that while we had to do them, was caused by COVID. And I believe the federal government's main obligation to states like New York, who've had to make those decisions to shut down businesses, is to take the lead and step up and say, because those decisions were made, because that created these kinds of shortfalls in state and city revenues, we need to step forward and play a major role in helping to bridge that divide. And so, from my perspective, when you look at the near, I mean, you know better than me, but if what I'm hearing, the near $30 billion in the next 2 years of revenue shortfalls, part of that conversation, in my view, has to start with where the federal government is going to step up and be a part of it. So that's the first important piece. I think we need to look at some revenue revenue adjustments. And we have I was chair of a working group that looked at that. I don't want to get into all the details of what we came up with, but some of them are obvious. We want to look at those issues, and then where appropriate, some spending cuts, because I think it needs to be a combination of everything that gets us there. But I do believe those decisions should be made comprehensively. I don't think we should do these sort of one-offs. We should do a comprehensive solution that includes federal and the state participating in a major way, and the city to sort of solve our sort of financial issues.
I think you're right. And the jumping off point has to be more federal aid directly to the state, to the city as well. Obviously, healthcare, restaurant industry, there's some talk about trying to put direct help there. It's all tied together. And to a certain extent, in New York, we've been waiting to see what the answer is going to be on federal stimulus. And I do think, with Biden winning, we have a better shot. But what's so important,
but real quick on that, because federal stimulus that is specifically targeted is not the federal stimulus that we need. We need a part of that federal stimulus to be sort of discretionary funds that are provided to the state to help with some of the shortfalls that we have. And I think that's the piece we need to, right.
You're absolutely right. Has to be direct aid to the state and to the city and other localities as well. Because the hole in the budget is not because of bad choices or bad decisions. The hole is because of, as you point out, everything being on hold, economic activity stopping, tax revenue falling off. For the city and the state, the other piece that's so important that I know you appreciate, so much of the state budget is money that's given to localities, including New York City.
Right.
And so if the state has to deal with this with budget cuts,
that's right,
it's going to make the city's situation worse. And it's New York City, and MTA. We need public transit to survive as well. It certainly is all tied together.
You saw the Wall Street Journal article that said you're looking at really $60 billion when you add it all up between the state over the next 2 years, between the state, the city, and the MTA. Those are real numbers. We can't tax our way into solving that problem. And if we tax and if we increase certain taxes, that has other consequences of reduced activity, whether people are leaving, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to be comprehensive about how we look at this problem. And I think we got to do that in a way that everyone is included in the process. Our wealthiest doing their part, but at the same time making sure that everyone across the board feels that this is a stable path forward. Because we got to regrow the economy, right? So regrowing the economy has got to be a part of the conversation. How does all of that work together is what we need to be looking to do.
We can't cut our way out of it, tax our way out of it, borrow our way out of it. You're right. It might be some combination of those, but it has to be done in a thoughtful way. You've been talking a lot about the city's budget and fiscal future. Do you want to add any perspective on that? We've been talking a lot about the state, but how do you feel the city is positioned right now?
I think the city is in a situation where I was on the phone with the budget director just yesterday. They got about a $4 billion gap that they need to figure out for the January preliminary budget. My view is that there needs to be some real thoughts around what does a city budget look like in COVID, right? We cannot imagine that there aren't changes, there aren't some programmatic items that should be reduced or some should be increased, et cetera. I think that we got to look much more carefully at that. I think that's something that I've talking to Comptroller Scott Stringer about, really looking at some programmatic investigations, audits, and activities that helps with sort of identifying, what are some of the key items. Because here's the thing, every dollar that the city wastes impacts marginalized communities immensely more than everyone else, right? If our public schools don't work and there's waste in our public schools, it's the kids in Harlem and East Harlem and the Bronx, Central Brooklyn, who feel the impacts of that significantly more, right? So one of the things that I think is important is that, as the city is making some of these decisions, I know remember this last cycle, there was a lot of conversation about the summer youth employment and cutting that program. And it's like, wait a minute, why on God's earth would we cut that program first, right? There's got to be some other things that we can look at, because we got to hire our young people, particularly those who are marginalized in communities of color that need support. So I think there's got to be a moral piece of this where we think about equity and how the city budget works. And in some cases taking money from those who need it less and giving to those who need more, and then where possible just cutting some things altogether because they've shown themselves to not be working. And some people won't be happy, but guess what? We will have a fairer city if we allocate all the money wisely in a way that is respectful and inclusive.
We got a few minutes left. Just in terms of what you're hearing, being back in the district and with a new legislative session coming up, obviously a lot of the focus will be on what we've been talking about. That's the budget and how we balance all that. What are the big issues that you're hearing from your constituents locally that you want to lend voice to during the next session?
Yeah, no question. There is definitely a lot of concerns around rent, whether it's commercial or residential. Evictions are a big concern. I'm a big supporter of eviction, of having an eviction moratorium that extends through the crisis with some extra time on the back end, so we can figure out how to deal with the amount of arrears across the board, residential and commercial. On the criminal justice side, there is definitely thoughts around how do we make sure that it's good quality of life while not over incarcerating, right? There are some folks who can be in jail for 4 to 6 to 8 years because they stole a bike. Now, stealing a bike's a really bad thing, but we got to think about what's the appropriate response to some of those things, particularly if poverty is a possible indicator. The criminal justice system, Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of thought around equity and making sure everyone is safe. And then lastly, our small businesses. I've lost a number of small businesses during this period, particularly ones owned by those of color. And the question is, what is the city and the state trying to do to help those businesses? And obviously, look, the government, I always believe the government does not run the private sector, right? But we create infrastructure that helps to provide opportunities for various things to grow. And I think our small businesses have to be on the top of our list because so many of them are hurting, and they matter because they form the bedrock of communities, right? There's a number, whether you go to the Upper West Side or Central Harlem or East Harlem, you have a number of vacant storefronts. Why is that? What are we not doing? And especially with COVID, now people are not traveling as much. And I don't know what happens once the vaccine's fully rolled out. Do we go back to business as before? Is there some new hybrid model? But there's a lot of street vendors, bodegas, small businesses that rely on that foot traffic. How do we think about those folks going forward? Those are the kinds of things that are going to be on the minds of our legislators, and that's what I'm hearing a lot from my constituents in the district. Big
important issues. We just have about 2 minutes left, but I want to get your thoughts on a very special person. I know someone who was important in your life. We recently had the passing of Mayor David Dinkins, and talk about an incredible life in public service. But share your thoughts about Mayor Dinkins and what lessons can we learn from that great life?
I got to spend a lot of time with him post, because he and I were in a Harlem Social Club together, which is an honor for me. I used to get to sit next to him at lunch once a month on a number of occasions. And one of the things you just know about him is that he is just a decent man with integrity, wouldn't say bad things about people. Always said to me whenever we talked, you are a representation of Harlem, you're a representation of Black men, you're a representation of something that's bigger than yourself. And you have to take that into consideration. Before you go say that nasty thing to someone, or you go do something that is inappropriate, know that you represent more than yourself, and make sure that the kids and the families and those who depend on you, when they look at you, they feel good about themselves because of how you conduct yourself as a representation of them. She's a very just thoughtful person. And as we exit the era of Donald Trump, who was the complete opposite of Mayor Dinkins in this regards, I think we want to get back to decency and integrity and just being just good people. And we can disagree, but we can disagree in a way that is respectful. That's what Mayor David Dinkins taught me.
And that's a great punctuation point to end our discussion. The time went by fast, Senator Benjamin, but I want to thank you for what you've said. I want to thank you for who you are. We're at a time where we need leadership, creativity, and elected officials who are grounded in the community and know what's happening. And that is you. So keep up your great work, stay safe, stay well, and we'll have you back on the show sometime again in the near future.
Thank you for your leadership. I appreciate it.
And I'm really pleased to invite my next guest to join us in the conversation, Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal. There she is on our virtual interview. Thank you, Linda, for joining us. Linda Rosenthal was first elected to the State Assembly by the residents of Clinton, Hell's Kitchen, and the Upper West Side. She has been an incredible advocate for her constituents on really, so many issues. And I've seen Linda Rosenthal in action up close in the Assembly, and certainly from my perch here in Albany in the State Comptroller's office. This is someone, I've lost track, Linda, of how many chapters you have been the prime sponsor for. You have been so active. I know you learned some of that serving as district director for Congressman Jerry Nadler, but in your own right, whether it's affordable housing, domestic violence, consumer protection, government reform, environmental issues, animal welfare. Wow, you have just been a leader not only for the 67th Assembly District, but really for all the people of New York. So welcome to this discussion. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's great to see you. And we overlapped a little bit when you were in the Assembly, and when you hear about people's reputations when you enter a body, and yours was always the best.
Thanks. But besides doing all that great work, not only in your district, but in Albany, you moved up to important leadership positions. I thought maybe we'd start talking a bit about your serving as chair of the Standing Committee on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse. Those are big issues for people in crisis at any time. Here we are living through COVID-19 pandemic. I'm conjecturing that's made a bad situation worse, rather, for many people. Could you just talk about, some of the issues you've been working on related to that, and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected that work and advocacy that you're involved in?
Absolutely. And I've been chair of that committee for about 5 years. And the population that we serve and we want to make sure gets enough attention are people who suffer from substance use disorder, which could be, heroin, cocaine, drugs, alcohol, gambling. And it is always one of the last priorities in the annual budget. And it's a sector that has been vilified in the past. The war on drugs back in the day, throw people in jail, discard them basically. And now the OASIS agency is one of the lowest funded agencies in the entire government. And now there's a plan to actually merge or create a new agency of OMH and OASIS. So OASIS will have even less of a profile. But all the problems with funding of services, availability of services throughout the state, and we know in the city of New York, there are many services, but once you leave here, upstate, you can drive an hour to get to some kind of clinic or healthcare. So all the problems that existed before COVID were actually magnified as is true for many other sectors, but initially, people who work in clinics and other areas having to do with substance use disorder were not even on the list to get PPE. So they had to function early on without masks and any kind of protective gear when dealing with the public. And people who have substance use disorder really should not have been out and about because their immune systems are more compromised than people who are more healthy. And so there was no delivery system, as there was an attempt to do in New York City to deliver people medications that they need. Methadone, people still had to come every single day to get their methadone at the start. So things changed slowly, and some people did get to take home larger doses, for example, but there were many more overdoses across the nation and in New York State. Yet the State Department of Health has failed to account for how many and has failed to post on its website, as required by law, reports of how many people overdosed during 2020. Because if you can't pinpoint the problem and track it through data, how are you going to address it? And I think that's part of the problem.
Is conjecture on my part, but I know I've been reading suicide rates have been up as well.
Absolutely.
How do they even begin to know whether an overdose was an accident or suicide related? I mean, those are
Exactly
tough to look at. But if you don't have the data, how can you? You're absolutely right.
That's right. And some counties have put some together, but the state has not, as a whole, accumulated all the data. In addition, withholding that the governor's been doing of 20% and across the not-for-profit sector, places are closing because the people who work there can't exist without a paycheck. And it's risky work for some. And it's absolutely essential. It's the state's safety net. And yet they are not getting their full funding, and they're not getting the CARES funding that we have, and they're not getting it. And that's a serious issue.
I'm glad you mentioned the nonprofits. We don't give enough attention to, first of all, the economic impact of that sector. Creates a lot of jobs, contributes a lot to the economy. But so many of those programs do services that government can't do directly or can't do it as well, very often on a shoestring budget. And they're trying to get through a time where they're for the direct service providers, even more need and demand on services. They can't do fundraising in this environment like they traditionally can. And because of people, not being able to give as much, they're not getting as much in terms of donation. And most of them were already operating on extended credit. And so now they come into a point where an expected payment from the state doesn't show up. And you're right, some of them are actually folding, and the long-term consequence of that is something, we have to look at. And let's hope if we get more of that federal stimulus and relief money, we could, those withholding of payments aren't outright cuts yet. Let's hope they don't turn into an outright cut. And I want to say I appreciate you mentioning gambling. Compulsive gambling is another kind of addiction that we don't pay enough attention to. We just put out a report, I think, as you know, that talking about gaming in the state, while it is a revenue source, it's been down because of the pandemic, but for lottery, marketing is like $90 million, for VLTs, much more than that. Yet the amount of money allocated, as you pointed out earlier, to provide for prevention or treatment of those that have compulsive gambling addiction is only like $5.7 million. It's a paltry amount. Your advocacy is so important there. I want to switch to another issue, a big concern to you, and not only in your district, but you've been a leader on this in Albany too, affordable housing. And I know you've had a particular concern about the warehousing of apartments.
Yes.
This is going to be a big issue. It was before the pandemic. It's a big issue now. Give me your thoughts on how we start to remedy some of that problem.
Yeah, I mean, for 20 something years, there was the landlord developer lobby controlled the state Senate. So we didn't get really any good progressive tenant protection laws over the years. And so the scales were very lopsided. And so back in 2019, we ended up passing the HSTPA, which really was a good bill to protect tenants. And it limited major capital improvements where there was a lot of corruption and et cetera, and individual apartment improvements where tenants were paying way too much. And there was no check and balance on that. So we limited the amount landlords can recoup for improving their buildings, which they own. As a consequence of the passage of that law, many landlords said, you know what, we're not going to rent out our units. We are just going to keep them off the market. Maybe biding time until they thought they had enough power or people in their corner to reverse some of these gains. But if they say, I'm not renting out these units, it deprives the city of middle and lower income people and residents. So now we found also, since the pandemic, many people have fled.
Yeah.
And so there are more vacant apartments. But landlords are not willing to make a deal in most cases. In fact, leases for rent for market rate, they've actually not given discounts. So it's a very precarious balance here with people needing affordable housing and landlords having the stock, but withholding. So I am in the process of developing a bill that would encourage, in a meaningful way, landlords to actually put those apartments on the market, and penalties and other things we're formulating to dissuade them from hoarding them. I really can't understand why, because they're all complaining about they're not getting paid rent. But there are people who can pay, and there are apartments that they can rent. It's just an imbalance, and it has to be fixed.
It's going to be a big issue for a long time to come as we rebuild the city. Linda Rosenthal, you're a great member of the Assembly because you work hard in your district and you get things done in Albany. Thanks so much for joining us. And to our viewers, thank you for watching Represent NYC on MNN, the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm State Controller Tom DiNapoli.